In the children's sermon, it is amazing when we celebrate the life of someone who has changed the course of world history as Jesus has. There is little said in our authentic scripture that we have, the 27 books of the New Testament. There is nothing really said about his life as a child. We have the incident of his birth, and we have the travel to Egypt to escape the persecution of the Roman emperor. And until that, except for the text that we have today in the Gospel of Luke, we know nothing about him until he begins his ministry at the age of 30. Now, there's 18 years there that we know nothing except one thing. And that's an incident at the age of 12 when he goes with his family to celebrate the great festival of Passover, one of the greatest festivals in the Jewish year. And he is among a group of travelers, probably numbered 80 to 100 people. And they traveled as a group. And all of them felt like family. If somebody was not particularly present at a certain time, you didn't worry about it because they might well be playing with cousins along the way or being adopted for another family for the day. Many societies have this kind of interaction among relatives and friends where children can be treated like their children as just a whole cultural pattern. But anyway, we have this incident of Jesus. Now, for those of you who were at the midweek Lenten services last year, you understand that there were a lot of books written about Jesus that are not included in our New Testament. We call them the apocryphal books. There's nothing strange about them. They are done by scholars who supposedly knew Jesus or knew about Jesus or recorded the stories about Jesus. But when the church fathers got together to what they call create the canon, those 27 authentic books of the New Testament, which we call Holy Scripture, they did not include them. And they were not included for many different reasons. And when we study the apocryphal books, we have to be a little careful because there are some incidents recorded there that probably are a good indication why they were not included in our present New Testament. The one that there are two at least that deal with Jesus' infancy and childhood. And there is another thing that is interesting about these books, and that is that they tell a lot more about Joseph. Because if you are aware of what's happening in our authentic books of the New Testament, they really don't say anything about Joseph either. The only time he is mentioned other than the birth is in this incident at the age of 12 when he had taken Jesus along with the family to Jerusalem to celebrate that great feast of the Passover. A lot of people, a lot of scholars believe that Joseph might have died fairly young, probably after this event that we read about in St. Luke, sometime after Jesus was 12 years old, probably before he reached 20. But the Gospel of Thomas, in describing Jesus, tells some interesting stories. And you kind of wonder why they were left out of the New Testament. Why was the New Testament that was selected by the church fathers so willing to leave out the young years of Jesus? I asked that question to our group this morning of high schoolers, and they really hadn't thought much about Jesus as a teenager. And maybe that's why the life of Jesus in his teenage years, his young years, were not included. Because usually those years that we had as young people, when teenagers, or as young adults, we would not like to include in our history. But to have a biography of a person which does not include his youth seems a little strange. Some of the most traumatic events of the high school or the elementary school or middle school years are events that change a child's life forever. Certainly, one of the greatest shaping events of my life happened at the age of 13. That is the year my father died. And I had to change drastically in life from being a child to pretty much becoming a young adult. Because that spring that my father died, I had to do all the farm work, put in the crops, and suddenly be a responsible adult. Probably why I did not get into a lot of trouble as a teenager. I was just too busy on the farm doing work and trying to fill in as an adult and to take care of my mother. But teenage years sometimes are those years that embarrass us. Sometimes they tell stories about us that don't really reflect what we want people to picture our lives now. As a matter of fact, there was a time when I was at a golf course and somebody asked if I knew somebody that was in my congregation. This is not this congregation, so don't start crystal balling who it was. But they said, "Is so-and-so a member of your congregation?" And I said, "Yes, he is." I said, he said, "I knew him as a child. I knew him as a student in high school. As a matter of fact, I was a classmate." And I said, "Yeah, but I think he's different now than he was when he was a classmate." And the response was, well, there was a lot of things he had to change. We probably, most of us, would not want our young years, our high school years, highlighted in our biographies because we like to think we're matured. And I think the gospel writers really wanted to portray a mature Jesus. But this incident in which we read today from Luke was kind of a turning point in Jesus' life. Now picture this. The church has always said that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. We confess that every single Sunday in our Apostles' Creed. He was fully human, fully divine. So Jesus did go through this childhood, and the Gospel of Thomas tells some interesting stories, some of which may be true, but some of which might not be true. But consider what happens if you have unlimited divine powers and you're a human being. The Gospel of Thomas tells us that he did not always use this prudently. And there are stories such as this. At the age of 5, Jesus is down by the seashore on the Sabbath. He's supposed to be resting. He's supposed to be observing the Sabbath. But he's taken some of his classmates down and he builds 12 little doves out of the sand. And one of the neighbors of Joseph sees him, and he comes to Joseph and reports his son. Says, "Your son is not obeying the Sabbath. What kind of a father are you anyway?" And he says, "Come down, I'll show you what he's doing." And Jesus sees Joseph coming down to the seashore. He breathes into the birds and tells them to get away. So when his father asks him, "Where are the birds?" he can say, "What birds?" It also says Jesus went down to the fork in the river, and he made little puddles and gathered the water in the puddles, and then he purified the waters so they were drinkable. There are all kinds of incidents in which he uses his powers in probably not such a good way. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's said that he, when he was angry, he would hurt people by putting a curse on them for a short time and then removing it. Again, this is up for belief or not belief. This is not in our authentic scripture, but there are stories that they recorded about Jesus. And at least we have to understand that during this period of time, Jesus was trying to get used to the fact that he had an unusual power that was given to him by God, and it had to be directed in a positive way. Just before this incident, which Thomas also records in his gospel, where he's in the temple, he has a story where somebody is playing with Jesus on the roof of one of the houses, and he falls off. And Jesus has been kind of a nuisance in the neighborhood, and sometimes his father had to sit him down and say, Jesus, you got to keep in control, because neighbors are going to kick us out of this town if you do these strange things. But while these two children are playing on the roof, one of them falls off and is taken up for dead. The parents of the young child come and accuse Jesus of pushing him off the roof. And Jesus says, no, it was not me. I'm not the culprit. And he comes down off of the roof, and he does his first raising from the dead, according to the Gospel of Thomas. And he asks the boy if he pushed him, and the boy says, no, but did I bring you back to life? He says, yes. Then comes this incident in the Gospel of Thomas, just the same as is written in the Gospel of Luke, where he talks about Jesus coming to the temple and staying after his parents leave as a symbol that he now was aware of his role as the Messiah, and that all his special powers needed to be used for the benefit of mankind and not as some kind of a nuisance. You can believe what you want about the Gospel of Thomas. It's not important. What is important, I think, to know in terms of his parents are three things that are important in the life of training any child. One of the things that the gospel tells us that Joseph and Mary were very, very adamant about Jesus always being in the temple at worship. One of the things that really puzzles me sometimes now is so many people say, I'm not going to force my children to come to church. I'm just going to let them be what they are until they're at the age where they can inquire on their own. It was the revelation to Joseph that was important, that he trained Jesus, and that the training had to be very emphatic, very powerful in recalling all the things from the Old Testament, because they all pointed to him. It is important that children be brought to a worship situation from their very youth so they understand the whole idea, the concept of worship. Otherwise, how will they have anything to compare it to when they are challenged about it later on in high school or college? The parents were very adamant about having him in temple. The second thing that his parents were very adamant about was having him trained well. Jesus, according to the Gospel of Thomas, sometimes taunted his teachers, and sometimes he asked them questions that they couldn't answer. But Joseph sought for teachers, and he examined the teachers to make sure that they were the best around, so they could train his child in the way he should go. A third thing that the parents were very emphatic about was that they allow the child to ask questions. Sometimes questions that confounded the spiritual authorities. But they never shamed him for asking questions because they thought it was imperative that he have an inquiring mind, and that mind would gradually lead him to his particular purpose on being here, appealing to that humanity which was a part of Jesus. Children should be allowed to ask questions and never embarrass them for asking questions. Jane Goodall is remembered for her trip to Africa and spending 30 years studying the ape population and the monkeys. She was at one time Baroness Jane Goodall. She grew up in a very wealthy family. And they were a little disturbed that she went and spent her life foolishly in Africa studying a particular animal kingdom. But she said one thing her mother did that really impressed her later on in life is always encouraged her to do things that would give her answers to questions she had about life. She said she remembers a particular time when she was 3, when she brought a can of worms and put them on her bed to see how they reacted. She wanted to watch them. She said most parents would have come to me and scolded me and told me what a bad child I was. My mother sat down and said, "I'm so glad you're interested in learning about God's creatures." But she says if you leave them on the bed, they will die because this is not their natural habitat. So please, let's take them back out to where they belong. She said she did this all the time. Whenever she did something kind of silly, because she had questions, her mother and father always complimented on her inquisitiveness and said, "This is the way you learn," and we support that. The fourth aspect of Joseph and the Holy Family was that they always supported their child, always gave him the knowledge that they cared for him, loved him, and directed him in the way that they thought God was leading him. One little incident from Scripture, the only time we learn about Jesus as a child, and we make certain guesses about how he reacted to things. I think it is important, if we understand the true humanity of Jesus, that we understand him as a child, sometimes getting into trouble, sometimes embarrassing his parents, sometimes razzing his teachers, but finding a point where all this is to be used for the goodness of mankind and for caring and for loving. That's the process of childhood. And that's the great mission of parents.